When you think of the world's first multinational corporation, you might picture men in powdered wigs sitting around a large oak table, signing papers and sipping tea. And you wouldn't be entirely wrong. But with the Dutch East India Company, or the VOC, you would be missing a much darker, more violent part of the story. This wasn't just a company. It was something else entirely. It was part business, part empire, and part crime syndicate. It had its own army, its own navy, and the power to wage war. It could sign treaties, mint its own coins, and even imprison or execute people. The VOC was a titan of trade, a giant that straddled the globe. But its foundations were built not just on commerce, but on something far more sinister. Imagine a modern company like Amazon or Apple having the legal right to declare war on a country. It sounds absurd, doesn't it? Yet that was the reality of the VOC. Granted a charter by the Dutch government in 1602, it was given extraordinary powers to secure a monopoly on the Asian spice trade. This wasn't merely a license to do business, it was a license to conquer. The line between a merchant and a soldier, between a clerk and a conqueror, became incredibly blurry. The company's directors in Amsterdam wanted profits, and they weren't particularly concerned with how those profits were made. They created a beast that they could barely control, one that operated thousands of miles away from any real oversight. The story of the VOC is often told as a triumph of early capitalism. It was, after all, the first company to issue public stock, and at its peak, it was worth more than many of today's tech giants combined. But this narrative of innovation and success conveniently ignores the methods used to achieve it. The company's history is littered with acts that we would today label as war crimes, corporate espionage, and racketeering. It behaved less like a legitimate business and more like a mafia don, demanding tribute, eliminating rivals by any means necessary, and enforcing its will through sheer unadulterated force. It was a trading company in name, but a criminal enterprise in practice. So as we peel back the layers of this historical behemoth, it's important to see it for what it truly was. The VOC wasn't just a pioneer of global trade, it was a pioneer of corporate malpractice on an epic scale. It wrote the playbook for how a company with too much power and not enough accountability can descend into lawlessness. It's a story of incredible wealth, yes, but it's also a story of incredible cruelty. The gleaming coins that filled its coffers were stained with blood. This is the tale of a company that became a kingdom, a merchant that became a monster, and a business that became a brutal syndicate. The Dutch East India Company had a simple, clear objective: to control the global spice trade. Spices like nutmeg, mace, and cloves were, in the 17th century, worth more than their weight in gold. They were the oil of their day. To secure this lucrative market, the VOC didn't just compete with its rivals, it sought to utterly destroy them. This is where the company's dual identity becomes so apparent. On one hand, it was a sophisticated commercial operation with shareholders, ledgers, and shipping schedules. On the other hand, it was a ruthless military machine that used violence as a standard business tool. It was a strange and dangerous hybrid, a merchant with a cannon. This mixture of business and brutality was not an accident, it was company policy. The VOC's charter explicitly gave it the power to build fortresses, to appoint governors, to raise an army and a fleet, and to make war. The directors knew that the spice-producing islands of Asia were not empty lands waiting to be claimed. They were populated by local rulers and visited by Portuguese, Spanish, and English traders. To establish a monopoly, the VOC had to push everyone else out. And so, its ships sailed from Amsterdam armed not only with contracts, but with cannons. Every trading post was a fortress, every merchant a potential soldier, ready to switch from haggling over prices to firing a musket. Think about the logic for a moment. If a local ruler decided to sell his spices to the English, the VOC didn't respond by offering a better price. It responded by blockading the port, sinking the English ships, and sometimes deposing the ruler himself. Violence wasn't the last resort, it was often the first. It was a calculated strategy to create fear and ensure compliance. The company's leaders in Asia, like the infamous Jan Pieter Zoon Cohen, were celebrated not for their diplomatic skills, but for their ruthlessness. Cohen famously wrote to the company directors, "We cannot carry on trade without war, nor war without trade." This chilling phrase perfectly captures the VOC's core philosophy. This approach set the VOC apart from its competitors. While other European trading companies also engaged in violence, none did so with the same scale, organization, and state-sanctioned authority. The VOC institutionalized brutality. It made war a line item on the corporate budget. The pursuit of profit was seen as a righteous cause that justified almost any action, no matter how violent or immoral. Local populations were not seen as partners but as obstacles. Competing traders were not rivals, but enemies to be eliminated. This toxic blend of commerce and conflict defined the VOC's operations for nearly 2 centuries, leaving a legacy of exploitation and bloodshed across the globe. While the VOC projected an image of immense power and efficiency to the outside world, its internal workings were riddled with corruption. It was a system almost designed for it. The company's employees were stationed thousands of miles from Amsterdam, in remote outposts where communication with headquarters could take over a year. Oversight was minimal, and temptation was everywhere. The official salaries paid to VOC employees, from governors down to clerks, were surprisingly low. This created a culture where personal enrichment through illicit means was not just common. It was expected. It was an open secret that many who went to work for the VOC came back incredibly wealthy. Embezzlement was rampant. Company officials regularly skimmed profits, manipulated account books, and stole goods from the warehouses they were supposed to be managing. A common practice was for officials to engage in private trade on the side, using the company's ships and resources to transport their own goods, which they would then sell for personal profit. This was strictly forbidden by the company charter, but it was almost impossible to enforce. A governor in Batavia or a factor on a remote island had immense power and opportunity. They could easily undervalue goods being purchased for the company and pocket the difference, or sell company property and claim it was lost or damaged. Bribery was another essential tool in the VOC's corrupt toolkit. To secure exclusive trading contracts, company officials would bribe local rulers with gold, silver, weapons, and other luxuries. These deals were often designed to undercut rivals and trap local leaders in agreements that heavily favored the company. But the bribery also worked in the other direction. Ambitious employees would bribe their superiors to get posted to lucrative locations where the opportunities for illegal side deals were greatest. The entire system was lubricated by a constant flow of under-the-table payments, creating a hierarchy based not just on merit, but on one's ability to play the game of corruption. This pervasive corruption became so bad that it had a nickname, de Moorschandel, or the spill trade. It was seen as an unofficial perk of the job. The VOC itself was sometimes referred to as Vergaan onder corruptie, which translates to perished by corruption. While this was a play on the company's initials, it held a deep truth. The sheer scale of the embezzlement and bribery eventually began to eat away at the company's profits. It created a shadow economy that benefited individuals but weakened the corporation as a whole. In the end, the rot within was as destructive as the enemies without, contributing significantly to the company's eventual downfall. Of all the brutal acts committed by the VOC in its pursuit of profit, none is more infamous than the Banda Islands massacre. These small islands, located in what is now Indonesia, were the world's only source of nutmeg and mace. For the VOC, controlling the bandas meant controlling the world's supply of these incredibly valuable spices. The Bandanese people, however, had long traded with various nations and resisted the VOC's attempts to enforce an exclusive monopoly. They continued to sell their nutmeg to English traders, who offered better terms. For the VOC's Governor-General, the uncompromising Jan Pieterszoon Cohen, this was an act of defiance that could not be tolerated. In 1621, Cohen arrived at the Banda Islands with a fleet of ships and a force of nearly 2,000 soldiers. His objective was not to negotiate, but to conquer. He intended to make an example of the Bandanese, to show the world what happened to those who dared to defy the company. What followed was not a battle, but a systematic extermination. Cohen's forces swept across the islands, slaughtering the local population. Villages were burned to the ground, and anyone who resisted was killed. The island's leaders were publicly executed in a gruesome and ritualistic manner, designed to terrorize any survivors into submission. It was an act of calculated, corporate-sponsored genocide. The scale of the atrocity was staggering. Before the VOC's arrival, the Banda Islands were home to an estimated 15,000 people. After Cohen's campaign, fewer than 1,000 remained. Most were killed, while others fled to neighboring islands or were enslaved and forced to work on the very nutmeg plantations they once owned. The VOC then repopulated the islands with enslaved people from other regions and leased the land to Dutch planters, known as percaniers, who were obligated to sell their entire nutmeg harvest to the company at a fixed low price. The monopoly was secured. The company had its nutmeg, but at a horrific human cost. The Banda Islands massacre stands as a chilling testament to the VOC's philosophy that trade and war were inseparable. It was the ultimate expression of corporate power untethered from morality. The company did not see the Bandanese as people or as trading partners, but as an obstacle to profit that needed to be removed. The event sent a clear and brutal message to rulers and competitors throughout the region. The VOC would stop at nothing to enforce its monopoly. This single event encapsulates the criminal nature of the company's enterprise, where the pursuit of wealth justified mass murder and the complete destruction of a society. The VOC's quest for monopoly was not just about eliminating human competitors, it was also about controlling nature itself. The company understood the basic economic principle of supply and demand better than anyone. To keep the prices of spices like cloves and nutmeg artificially high in Europe, they had to ensure that supply remained strictly limited. This led to one of the most destructive and unusual corporate strategies in history: the systematic sabotage of spice production. The company didn't just want to control the trade of spices, it wanted to control their very existence, turning entire ecosystems into carefully managed assets for its balance sheet. One of the most extreme examples of this was the policy of extirpatee, or extirpation. On islands where the VOC had established a monopoly, such as Ambon for cloves, the company would send out annual expeditions to destroy any clove trees growing outside their officially sanctioned plantations. Soldiers would march through the forests and villages, hacking down and burning any unauthorized spice trees they found. This was done to prevent local people from harvesting and selling cloves to smugglers or rival traders. It was a scorched earth policy applied to botany, a war waged not against an army, but against the natural abundance of the land itself. This strategy had devastating consequences for local communities. For centuries, these spice trees had grown wild and been a source of livelihood for the islanders. The VOC's policy of destruction robbed them of their economic independence and made them completely reliant on the company. If a village was suspected of illegal trading, the VOC's response would be swift and brutal. They would destroy all the trees in the area, plunging the community into poverty as a form of collective punishment. This ecological warfare ensured that the company was the sole gatekeeper of the world's clove supply, allowing it to dictate prices and reap enormous profits back in Europe. This manipulation of markets through the destruction of crops was a form of economic sabotage on a grand scale. While competitors were trying to find new sources of spices, the VOC was busy destroying them. It was a deeply cynical and short-sighted strategy. By concentrating all clove production in a few small, heavily guarded areas, the VOC made the supply vulnerable to disease and natural disasters. But in the short term, it worked. The price of cloves in Amsterdam skyrocketed, and the company's coffers swelled. It's a powerful example of how a corporation, obsessed with control, can resort to incredibly destructive acts to protect its market position, even if it means burning the world down to rule over the ashes. The Dutch East India Company was granted powers that, honestly, no modern corporation could ever dream of. Its charter, issued by the Dutch government, effectively turned it into a sovereign entity in Asia. The company was not just a guest in foreign lands. It acted as the government. It could negotiate treaties with local rulers as if it were a nation-state. It could build forts and garrison them with its own soldiers. It had its own legal system and could arrest, try, and punish anyone within its jurisdiction, including through execution. This fusion of corporate and state power created a terrifying entity, accountable to almost no one. This unique status as a state within a state was central to the VOC's business model. When the company signed a treaty with a local sultan, it wasn't a simple trade agreement. It was often a pact of submission, forcing the sultan to sell his goods exclusively to the VOC at a fixed price. If the sultan later tried to back out or trade with someone else, the company could declare him in breach of an international treaty and legally justify a military invasion. The VOC used the language and authority of a state to enforce its commercial interests, blurring the line between diplomacy and coercion, between law and corporate policy. The abuse of these powers was constant and systematic. The company's private army and navy were not used for defense but for offense, to intimidate and conquer. Its legal system was not used to dispense justice but to enforce compliance. For example, workers who went on strike or local farmers who held back some of their harvest for their own families could be charged with rebellion or theft against the company state and face brutal punishment. There was no independent judiciary to appeal to, no higher authority to petition for redress. The company was the police, the prosecutor, the judge, and the executioner, all rolled into one. This concentration of power created an environment where exploitation was inevitable. The VOC was motivated by one thing: profit for its shareholders back in Amsterdam. But it wielded the power of a government, which is supposed to be responsible for the welfare of its people. This fundamental conflict of interest was at the heart of the VOC's tyranny. It used the tools of a state, war, law, and governance, not to protect citizens or uphold justice, but to maximize returns on investment. This dangerous precedent showed the world what can happen when a commercial enterprise is given the power of a state without any of the accompanying responsibilities or ethical constraints. For the ordinary people who lived in the territories controlled by the VOC, life was often a grim and oppressive experience. The company's relentless drive for profit reshaped entire societies, and rarely for the better. Local farmers, who had once cultivated a variety of crops for their own sustenance and for trade, were often forced into monoculture farming. On some islands, every available patch of land was converted to grow spices for the company. This made communities completely dependent on the VOC for food and other necessities, which the company would then sell back to them at inflated prices. It was a cycle of dependency and exploitation. The workers who toiled on the VOC's plantations, in its mines, or on its ships, faced brutal conditions. Many were enslaved people, captured in wars or bought from regional slave traders. They had no rights and were treated as disposable property. But even the contracted laborers, both European and Asian, endured immense hardship. They worked long hours for meager pay, often in dangerous environments. Disease was rampant in the crowded forts and settlements. Punishment for minor infractions was harsh, and dissent was crushed without mercy. For many, signing a contract with the VOC was a one-way ticket to an early grave. The company's presence also had a corrosive effect on local cultures and political structures. The VOC would often play local rulers against each other, supporting one faction against another in exchange for favorable trade deals. This divide and conquer strategy destabilized entire regions, sparking civil wars and undermining traditional systems of governance. The company inserted itself into the political fabric of Asia, but its motives were purely commercial. It propped up puppet rulers who would serve its interests and ruthlessly deposed those who would not. In doing so, it shattered ancient alliances and sowed divisions that would last for centuries. The impact was felt not just by the governed, but also by the company's own low-ranking employees. Young men from the Netherlands, lured by promises of adventure and wealth, often found themselves trapped in a brutal and lonely existence. Stuck in a disease-ridden outpost thousands of miles from home, they were cogs in a vast, impersonal machine. Many died from tropical illnesses, or in one of the company's endless skirmishes. Those who survived were often hardened and corrupted by the system they served. The shadow of the VOC was long and dark, and it fell upon everyone from the enslaved plantation worker to the homesick Dutch soldier. The Dutch East India Company officially dissolved in 1799, bankrupt and rotten from the inside out. But its ghost lingers on. The VOC may be gone, but the tactics it pioneered have echoed through history, providing a dark blueprint for corporate misconduct that is still disturbingly relevant today. The company was the first to show, on a global scale, how a corporation with immense power and little oversight can act with impunity, prioritizing profit above all else, including human life and ethical decency. Its story serves as a foundational text for understanding the potential dangers of unchecked capitalism. The VOC's use of bribery to secure contracts and influence governments is a tactic that has never gone away. We see its modern-day equivalent in headlines about multinational corporations paying massive fines for bribing foreign officials to win lucrative deals in developing countries. The company's ruthless drive for monopoly, eliminating competitors by any means necessary, is mirrored in the aggressive anti-competitive practices of some modern tech giants who use their market dominance to crush smaller rivals. The basic impulse, to control the market and dictate the terms of business, is the same, even if the methods are now more subtle and legally complex. Furthermore, the exploitation of labor in the pursuit of lower costs is a direct legacy of the VOC's model. The company used enslaved people and poorly paid contract workers to maximize its profits. Today, we see a similar dynamic in the global supply chains of some fashion and electronics companies, where products are made in factories with unsafe working conditions and poverty-level wages. The geographical distance between the consumer in a wealthy country and the worker in a poor one creates a disconnect, much like the distance between Amsterdam and Batavia. This allows for a kind of willful ignorance about the human cost of our consumer goods. The VOC's most dangerous legacy, however, is the idea that a corporation can become so powerful that it operates beyond the effective control of any state. The company blurred the lines between business and government, using state-like powers for private gain. In the 21st century, some global corporations have revenues larger than the GDP of many countries. Their immense wealth gives them enormous political influence, allowing them to lobby governments, shape legislation, and challenge regulations that might hurt their profits. They may not have private armies, but they wield the power of capital, which can be just as potent in shaping the world to their liking. The story of the Dutch East India Company is more than just a fascinating chapter in history. It is a timeless and urgent warning. It demonstrates with chilling clarity the dangers that arise when corporate power is allowed to grow unchecked. The VOC was not born evil. It was a commercial enterprise that, in its relentless pursuit of profit, became a criminal syndicate. Its journey into darkness was paved with a series of small, rational decisions, each one designed to increase shareholder value, but which collectively led to atrocities and exploitation on a colossal scale. This is the slippery slope that every society must guard against. The core issue, then and now, is accountability. The VOC operated in a world where it was largely unaccountable for its actions. The vast distance from its home country, combined with the state-sanctioned powers it held, created a perfect storm for abuse. It could act as a conqueror, an enslaver, and a racketeer, all while reporting back to its investors in Amsterdam about shipping schedules and profit margins. This history teaches us that power, especially corporate power, must be constrained by strong laws, transparent oversight, and a clear ethical framework. Without these guardrails, the pursuit of profit can easily become a justification for immense harm. When we look at the world today, the echoes of the VOC are undeniable. We see them in debates about the environmental damage caused by corporations in their quest for resources. We see them in discussions about the exploitation of workers in global supply chains. We see them in concerns about the outsized political influence of tech and pharmaceutical giants. The fundamental tension between the corporate goal of maximizing profit and the societal need for justice, fairness, and sustainability is as real in the 21st century as it was in the 17th. The scale is different, and the methods may be more sophisticated, but the underlying challenge remains the same. Therefore, remembering the VOC is not about dwelling on the past. It is about learning for the future. It is a reminder that the structures we build to regulate commerce are not just bureaucratic details. They are essential defenses for our humanity. The tale of the world's first and perhaps most criminal corporation should compel us to remain vigilant. It urges us to ask critical questions about the role of corporations in our society, to demand transparency, and to insist that the pursuit of wealth can never be an excuse for abandoning our moral compass. The VOC is a warning written across the centuries, a message in a bottle from a dark past, telling us to beware the monster that can grow when greed is given a crown and a sword.